Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Paul Saunders with the Center for the National Interest in Washington. We appreciate all of you everywhere signing on to join us for today's conversation about America's technology relationship with some of its key European allies. We're very pleased to have with us two great speakers today. Paul Steidler and Yaël Ossowksi. Paul is a senior fellow at the Lexington Institute, which is a public policy think tank in Arlington, Virginia, and he works there on federal policy on technology and logistics and a variety of other issues, and really a very frequent writer and very interesting thinker on these topics. And also Yaël Ossowski, who is Deputy Director of the Consumer Choice Center. In that capacity, he's a consumer and technology advocate, does a lot of public policy work, and with a background as a journalist, a policy analyst, and actually is a grassroots organizer, also in both Europe and here in North America. So we're really delighted to have both of you with us today. Thank you so much to talk a little bit about the U.S. EU and also the U.S. UK relationships. We've had a little bit of breaking news today on the U.S. UK relationship, and look forward to hearing your perspectives on that. So we'll ask each of you to speak briefly, perhaps for 5 to 7 minutes. Then we'll open up for questions from our audience today. I may have a few questions myself as well. And I guess the last thing I should mention is, we're particularly pleased to have had each of you write for the center's publication, The National Interest, where you contributed to our Techland blog, which covers technology issues and great power competition and a variety of related topics. So thank you so much for being with us here today. Yaël, I think we said that we would start with you, so please take it away.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for having me, and to both Pauls. Great to be here on the panel with you. So I think my focus right now is just discussing the sort of issues that exist in the digital space between both the United States and the European Union. And this is where you've had many different news items that have come across the transom in the last couple of months and weeks. A lot of nail biting, a lot of different elections that have changed the calculus, and a lot of fights, a lot of rhetoric, definitely very, very heated debates that are going on. So principally, you've had President Trump, who's come in. He's been very forceful that he's going to protect the interest of American companies. And at the same time, you have the European Union, which has its own versions of different digital bills that they have passed over many, many years, what they call regulations. And essentially, the American tech companies that are servicing Europeans are having to comply with that. And that has actually become a stick in the trade relationship or negotiations between the United States and Europe. So this is all very complicated because there's so many things different that are going on. I think principally where I'll start is just to say that the way that the European Union practices digital regulation on many of its companies and any companies that service people on the continent are principally through two main regulations. One is called the Digital Services Act, and another one is called the Digital Markets Act. So these were proposed by the European Commission. The European Commission offered that. The European Parliament offered different amendments. It was agreed to by the European Council and effectively became a regulation and is now in force. And this is very different to the American style of regulation. Obviously, the American style is common law, much like the UK, as we'll hear from Paul later. And in Europe, it's much more the civil system. So what these laws do is they actually invent these obligations for various companies that would like to provide digital services. Some of these are takedown orders, interoperability, any kind of minors, if they're allowed online, whether they have to use ID. So all of these are kind of built into the laws as obligations. And if there is to be some kind of contravention of those obligations, which is up to the commission, then they basically do a report and then they issue fines. And we've had fines that have now been issued against most of the major American tech companies: Apple, Google, Meta, Amazon, you name it. There have been some kind of penalties that have been waged or some kind of investigation. And that is happening at the same time that Trump is now in his second presidency aiming to actually have a new tech pivot. So he's also talking about championing American technology, American companies abroad, and using the stick of trade relationships to protect American companies. So that is sort of the landscape that's happening between the two. Again, all the meanwhile, in the United States, we have our own regulatory agencies and antitrust and competitive or competition agencies that are suing many of these companies. We have right now the remedies that are being discussed for breaking up Google, making them sell their Chrome browser. There's the case right now with Apple, where that one would be for opening up the app stores. There's ongoing cases against Meta, ongoing cases against the other parts of Google when it comes to search. So there's all kinds of different cases that are happening on the US side where our own policies are attacking some of these companies and really changing the calculus of how our country is supposed to be globally, internationally, saying that we're going to promote these technologies and stop foreign bad actors who are practicing what they call non-tariff barriers. So it's a bit of a hot potato right now for the Trump administration because there's a lot of due to the president's rhetoric, particularly on trade. We've seen this in Canada, where you've had a recent election, and you've seen it in Europe, where they had an election and they've had a new German chancellor who's just elected. There's a lot of rhetoric in the room right now. And I think it's a good opportunity to kind of cool our heads, to look at the transatlantic relationship and realize that actually this partnership between liberal democracies that exists between the United States and the European Union, especially we're talking today, Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, that is something that we should continue to strive to protect. It has to persevere. And hopefully we can have cooler heads and have better policies and discussions. There's work to do on both sides of the Atlantic, but I think at least we've opened up room for negotiation to make sure that we aren't going to have all the different penalties. We're not going to have more restrictive things. So I hope that's the way to go. That's sort of my opening salvo.
Great. Thank you very much. I think that gets us off to a terrific start. Paul, please, your thoughts on the US-UK piece.
Yes. So the title for today's forum is Tech Trade or Digital Drama, the US, the UK, and the EU. And I would submit that when we talk about technology, the EU and the UK, we are talking about things that are quite important here, that have enormous consequence. This goes beyond a lot of needlessly dramatic issues out there. What I mean by that is that we have to see the US relationship with the EU and the UK in the context of our relationship with China. And the US relationship with China is driven right now by AI. Whoever is dominant in AI is going to be the world leader for the next century, and in a race that has no end. This is highly consequential. People may think of AI as just stuff that helps your kids with their homework or funny videos that you can see, but this is about who is going to have the strongest military power. It's about who's going to have the systems and the platforms that are going to drive economic growth and prosperity and cure diseases. It's also about our culture here. The Chinese are going to use AI to spy, are using AI to spy on and oppress their people and to put out other things that are quite harmful. So just as it was essential for the United States to have alliances to defeat the Soviet Union, it is essential for the United States to have alliances to prevail over China as far as AI goes. In fact, it may be more essential because the Chinese are already out there working with dozens of companies to promote their systems. Right now, as Yaël has alluded to, as Yaël has said, our relationship with the EU, especially on tech stuff, is very bad. There's a very hopeful sign in this, though, and that is that the US relationship with the UK on tech and other measures is good. The White House today, along with Prime Minister Starmer, announced a trade deal. It's more a framework for an agreement, a fuller agreement that's going to come into play. But it does reduce tariffs. The US does have a trade surplus with the United Kingdom. It's a very positive step in the right direction. What is good for the US is that the United Kingdom has a very strong tech sector and a very strong AI sector, which gets ignored. Some statistics from the recently issued Stanford University 2025 AI Index. The UK had 885 AI companies funded from 2013 to 2024. That's half as much as China, and that is way more than the next leading company, France, at 468. The US had close to 7,000. We're still very dominant there, but the UK is the number 3 player in that regard. The UK has also attracted sizable private investment in AI during that period, $28 billion. The next runner-up in Europe was Germany at $13 billion. There are, though, significant problems for US companies that are operating in the UK that are not too much different from what companies are facing in the EU. There are digital taxes on big US companies. There is a British Online Safety Act, which has led to great concerns being voiced by J.D. Vance and Elon Musk, and concerns that US citizens could be in violation of British laws on these, even if they say or post something when they are not in the United Kingdom, and they might theoretically find themselves being arrested going over there. The bottom line is that Prime Minister Starmer is very committed to expanding AI in the United Kingdom. He actually sounds very Trumpian, very pro-market oriented, as does his Secretary of State for Science, Innovation, and Technology, Peter Kyle. Some of the steps that Starmer has taken, he fired the head of the competitions unit. He's given very strong speeches calling for investment in tech in the United Kingdom. For example, he said back in October at an international investment conference, it's time to upgrade the regulatory regime. We will rip out the bureaucracy that blocks investments. We will march through the institutions, and we will make sure that every regulator in this country, especially our economic and competition regulators, takes growth as seriously as this room does. If that doesn't sound Trumpian, I don't know what you can find to make it sound more Trumpian. Back in the month of March, the Prime Minister Starmer had a very good meeting with President Trump on February 27th, talking about these issues. He talked in press releases about how expanding tech investment in the UK was his top priority. That seemed to have gotten overshadowed because the next day was the Zelensky meeting in the White House, which seemed to have taken on a growth of its own. The Starmer administration has been very outspoken about how it's attracted tech investments to date, though those have been rather modest. And the bottom line is we should look to structure an agreement with the United Kingdom whereby the fines and the taxes are eliminated, and US companies are encouraged to go over and expand operations in the UK, which some are already doing via building data centers and whatnot. And by doing that, we will establish a beachhead in Europe for tech expansion. The benefits to the UK will be sizable, and this can serve as a model for what the EU can adopt going forward. I think the framework for that is already in place. It's critically important that it get done. It may be easy to, for some to dismiss Europe as being important for US tech. Their tech sector is a mess. They're already cozying up to the Chinese, but it is in our best interest to work with them and have them use our technology and us to work with their tech companies to determine the future that we're going to have. Otherwise, that future is going to be driven and determined by the communist Chinese, who do not have our best interests, or I would submit the interests of free people of the world at heart. Thank you, Paul, for the opportunity to be here, and to the National Interest for hosting this, and look forward to the discussion ahead.
Well, thank you very much to you, Paul. Also, I think a lot in there for us to talk about. Let me encourage everyone in the audience who may have a question to submit that using the Q&A tab at the bottom, and I will read those questions as they come in. Maybe as a departure point, just to get us started here, regulations are often one of those topics that I think outside of the Beltway and perhaps the Washington, D.C. Beltway, and perhaps even inside it, often make people's eyes glaze over. But it seems like one of the central challenges that we have here is kind of a mismatch between, in the US-EU case, between regulatory systems that are themselves kind of evolving and trying to keep up with technological change, and we have in the United States kind of often a view that we should have as little regulation as is reasonably possible. And among at least some in the European Union, a view that regulation actually is Europe's superpower, and that the European Union is going to kind of bring order to the rest of the planet by gradually expanding its regulatory system and standards everywhere else. Is this just something that's irreconcilable? You brought up, Yaël, also the sort of the different foundations for our two legal systems. Is that something we can get beyond, or are we just doomed to wrangle about all of these issues for eternity?
I actually do think that a lot has changed, and I think the coming of Trump, the rhetoric of Trump, has forced a lot of change. There's an omnibus process that comes with amending various parts of these regulations, and you have also the AI Act. I'm happy that Paul mentioned a lot about AI. You also have the AI Act, which will be coming into force, and there, essentially, a lot of the European legislators, lawmakers, commissioners have understood that they just don't have the cards, if I can use that term from Trump, right? They don't have the industry. They don't have the unicorns that the United States have. They don't have the deep capital markets. So a lot of stuff that Europe has tried to do now is really to address that and really do it in a way that they can benefit their own people, they can benefit their own companies, but still kind of keep the path open. I know that there's been some overtures to China, but realistically right now you have 80% of European companies that use American products when it comes to digital cloud or digital services. So we're in Europe very dependent on everything that's happening in the United States and a lot of the innovations there. So I think that market reality is something that is waking a lot of people up. In the most recent omnibus, this happened a few weeks ago, there was discussion about the Green New Deal. And because of not just the war in Ukraine, but also just because of the energy realities and inflation, there's this kind of acceptance that the Green New Deal, as it was envisioned, and higher carbon prices, net zero, some of that has to be put on pause. And a lot of people who are in the European Commission used a lot of the examples from the United States of look how much innovation that they're doing, look how much they actually use things like nuclear energy. We need to be able to use all of that energy to power our own AI revolution and to power our own tech companies. So a lot of times it's not very explicit. A lot of times it will be coded in European language that probably to an American ears is very difficult to understand, but it is reactionary. And it is difficult, yes, between the two systems, but that's why we need to find at least common sense rules. There have been agreements. We've had data transfer agreements that have been in place for many years, and that stuff has worked. And that stuff is something that both sides have been very happy with. I think a lot of the times the obligations of the European regulations will just have to be revised. And if you can fine tune them, if you can make it so that you actually enforce it a bit more locally and not just from international companies that might not have as big of a footprint, at least physically, that actually is a path. And there are conversations about that. There are debates. Many of the different European commissioners who deal with digital policies have been in Washington, D.C. They've been trying to get close into the MAGA crowd, trying to sell that message. And I do think there is a path there. So I do not think it's irreconcilable, mostly because Europeans are also consumers and they're very big consumers of American digital services. And there has to be some path so that they can use it, because otherwise there's a continent that'll be left behind. And with the openness of the internet, Europeans can see that there are certain AI tools they can't use. Because of GDPR, there are certain things they can't access. These are the things that, as more people are online and they're seeing what their compatriots are seeing in the United States or even Japan, even in the UK, that is going to force a change. So actually, that's one good advantage of having a liberal democratic system is I think there will be a lot more pressure on those institutions.
Thank you very much for that. Paul, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add in Europe, there's a recent report from Mario Draghi, came out in September of last year, the former president of the European Central Bank, where he rings alarm bells about the need for tech innovation in the European Union and how the continent is suffering because of lack of that. There's been a lot of very good rhetoric surrounding that, but excuse me, there's been a lot of very good rhetoric surrounding that, but unfortunately, it's been very slow to implement those provisions. I think, to Yael's point, or one of his basic points here. One of the things about technology is you can see the benefits of it around the globe. I mean, you can know the benefits that people in Japan and California and elsewhere are realizing from it. So people in Europe are not going to be kept in the dark about these benefits. A lot of these regulations have, really been driven, I think, to raise money and harass U.S. companies instead of, they're not applied equally to European countries, and especially if we expand, if we make Britain a more Silicon Valley-like prosperous place, I think that'll have big ramifications for folks in Europe wanting to see similar benefits from that.
If I can add one point to Paul, we've already seen that with Ireland, which is sort of the capital home of American companies who want to do business in Europe. So there's already a model for a flexible system that allows companies to come in and register, pay a reasonable tax rate as opposed to Germany or other countries, and then be able to sell their products and actually have a good regulatory environment in order to do so. We just don't have that yet for the digital services, unfortunately, but we have that model with Ireland, which at least is one good thing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a question here from Nick Gwozdev, who's actually one of our former editors of the National Interest, now at the Naval War College. And Nick is referring to former Congressman Mike Gallagher, who I think also has been an advocate for a much closer U.S.-UK technology relationship, as a component of the wider U.S.-UK relationship. Paul, I think this is probably mainly for you, but Yaël, if you have anything to add. Do you feel that the agreement today could open up some new possibilities for a closer U.S.-UK technology relationship? Did you see anything in the conversation today that might hint at that?
Well, the short answer is yes, it's a positive, but the possibilities have been out there for quite a while. I mean, Prime Minister Starmer unveiled and discussed those possibilities before coming to Washington and meeting with the president on February 27th. So, look, it's a positive step. It's a step in the right direction. There's still more that needs to be done. I mean, we'll know that we have achieved things when major American tech companies are announcing multi-billion-dollar investments in the United Kingdom, when huge data facilities are being set up, when there are provisions perhaps for the U.S. to be exporting liquefied natural gas to power those facilities. It's a step in the right direction. It's positive. So I think we should see it in that context. And I would just encourage our friends in the United Kingdom to keep being persistent about this. The United Kingdom very much wants a free tech agreement with the United States, but we're not their only option out there. I mean, they just on Tuesday announced a major trade deal with India, which is also a tech powerhouse out there. So we need countries around the world who are going to work with us in the tech sector. The United Kingdom, for various reasons, I think is the best country that we can possibly work with. They want to work with us. I mean, Israel, by the way, a small country of 8 or 9 million people, has a very dynamic tech sector that's stronger than many European countries. We ought to be cultivating things with them. But yes, things today are positive. They're good. If I had my druthers, a full free trade agreement would be in place. But those things are more easily said than done, and there's a lot of real world challenges on them.
Absolutely. Well, again, let me encourage our audience to send in questions via the Q&A tab. Let me here just ask maybe one or two others. First of all, Paul, you alluded in your opening remarks, to the national security issues that are at stake in AI and technology generally. Could you elaborate a little bit more what you mean by that? I mean, what are the kind of specific threats or advantages that could come in the U.S. direction as a result of leading or not leading and having kind of more allies and partners rather than fewer?
Sure. So AI is going to be endemic in military systems and strategies going forward. One area where it's already quite important is on cybersecurity. China is the leading hacker in the world, the leading cyber hacker in the world. I think the FBI has said if you combine every other country, they still don't add up to the hacking activities of China. AI is something that is either going to increase or mitigate cyber attacks. So the Chinese will be able to supercharge that to get into our government files and attack us. We need, cyber attacks, especially things that can shut down basic infrastructure, are an act of war. It can have the same effect as planes coming over and bombing a nuclear power plant to shut down. Certainly on the cybersecurity aspect, that is something that is here and now that should be top of mind and where we should have added resources and added protection. But there's been, various talks about things like how AI can be used for drones that could take out jets and fighter jets and cause other problems. We also, my colleague, Dr. Rebecca Grant here at the Lexington Institute, looks at those issues in depth. And I would, encourage people who want to know more about that to visit our website at lexingtoninstitute.org and check those things out as well. But certainly top of mind is we have to do a better job of protecting ourselves from cyber attacks, and AI is integral to that.
Thank you, Paul. Yael, anything that you'd like to add on the national security point?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important things. Obviously, I didn't mention in the first part because a lot to get through. But yeah, this is why I mentioned that we have these liberal democracies that have traded for a very long time, very freely, at lower cost than in other countries, and that's been to our mutual advantage. And when you have other kind of autocratic systems like China, like the Chinese Communist Party, they do not use their companies the same way we do. A lot of this stuff I was mentioning before we got on the call, having traveled around Asia recently, you have the Belt and Road Initiative, you have a lot of Chinese investment buying up ports, buying up any kind of security apparatuses, airports, any kind of infrastructure. And that is not for the benefit of just some XYZ stakeholder or shareholder. This relates right back to the Chinese state and to the broader aims of the Chinese Communist Party. And there was just recently, in the last 2 months, very big scandal in the European Union, in the European Parliament, where you have the lobbyist from Huawei, one of the Chinese telco providers, and they were just splashing money around town. There's all kinds of money that was entering accounts of certain parliamentarians, and all kinds of different shady behavior. And it has to do with essentially procurement and contracts. And that's something that we always have to keep in mind, is that China and even countries like Russia are always knocking on the door, always finding their way that they're going to get in there and really to try to disrupt what's happening. And that's why the focus on the digital issues obviously very important, but there also has to be that look at national security, the military, NATO, also energy. You have, in Europe, you've had for a number of years now an energy crisis. Prices are much higher than they are in the United States. And finally, thanks to President Trump, we have the opening up of the LNG market. So finally, we can get all of that American liquid natural gas to the markets and the newly built terminals that exist in the European Union, which is going to help so many of these issues and problems. And it's not something that will be solved by importing more Russian gas, which comes with its own baggage and issues, obviously. And I think that's another thing that many of the different political actors on either side of the Atlantic will have to focus on, is that we have much more in common between us and should focus on that. And I think the efforts that have been made against some of the telecom providers, looking at how you have a tech stack that is very sovereign or that uses only companies from liberal democratic countries, is a good thing. I think is actually good for consumers, very good for our security, very good for our privacy. There are standards that we have in our countries that do not apply once you go outside. So I think that's something that we should continue to focus on and should continue to give a leg up to the countries that are willing to trade between the United States, Europe, and the UK.
Thank you very much. That's a great segue. You both referred actually briefly to China in your comments, and we have a question now from Katie Strickland, who's asking, can you talk more to the EU and UK relationships with China, their use of CCP, that's Chinese Communist Party backed technology companies? How effective have the EU and UK efforts been to get Huawei technology out of their systems? And is this something that the administration should take up in the context of its wider trade conversations with Europe and with the UK? Paul, perhaps you could start.
Sure. So I would make the point Well, let me take a step back here. First of all, there are some good things about Chinese technology, and we ought not, condemn everything the Chinese are doing technologically. If the Chinese can use AI to find some medical cures or to find ways in which to increase agricultural production or to reduce pollution in their cities, that's great. That's terrific. But that's not all that they're doing with it, especially on the international front. We already know that they have systematically stolen intellectual property from US companies, and that is a state-sponsored policy, although they'll officially deny it. And I would simply say that we have to be very wary when the Chinese are coming into our countries about how much of their technology is going to be in place, because it's the nature of technology that you can, get a small foothold somewhere and often just use that to create a great deal of havoc. I think it's clear from how the UK has acted and from the campaign that Prime Minister Starmer and his technology minister, Peter Kyle, are on, that they want to work with us. They prefer to work with us to China. I was very struck by the statistic that Yaël used before, or mentioned before, about I think it was 80% of China EU technology is US based. So, the other thing is, if the Chinese do gain a bigger foothold, it's harder to get them out at that point. It's harder once they get integrated into our systems, once they get established there, to pull them out, which is why early progress on AI is so key, and preventing them from getting in, especially at sensitive sectors or getting in via cyber attacks, is especially important here. So, these are challenges that I think we can face, that I think that we can prevail upon, but we have to be vigilant, and we have to be vigilant now. We can't wait for a year or two from now to get tuned into these issues, because we'll have a bigger, more difficult problem to deal with.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Your
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah, I think Paul really made a very good point there, that, we obviously there are national security concerns, and the examples that have been used, particularly with telco, national security. I mean, a lot of this has been related to radars and telecommunication systems for the military and different parts of the government in UK and elsewhere. And I think those are really important and are necessary. At the same time, we cannot pretend that we will just create all these brand new supply chains of technological tools and factories that'll be all domestically sourced. It's just not going to happen. And I advocate for consumers, and consumers want to have cool, cheap tech that they can afford, that they can ensure that they have their own privacy and their own security. And you have options for doing that. I think all the conversations around how we restrict access, whether it be to our markets, our technology, I think that it has to be very much with a fine-tooth comb. TikTok is the one example. This is the social media app, very, very popular, owned by a Chinese firm. There's some American investors, but there's all kinds of different CCP initiatives involved in that. And that has been a very contentious affair, even though this was a law that was passed by Congress, that was signed into law by Joe Biden. It sort of came up for being put into practice the exact time that Trump was inaugurated, and he sort of pushed it off. He's used the delay, and we haven't really had that debate or conversation again about why this is important. Again, it was not a ban, it was a forced divestiture, which is something that we thought was a reasonable idea, to allow some kind of American or even liberal democratic country tech partner to be able to buy up and use, and to be sure that the algorithm is not being used for CCP aims and political aims. And that's something that we always have to keep in mind. The national security stuff, as we can see with the current Trump administration, is being invoked on many different issues. Hollywood, lumber, Canada, you name it, cars. Everything is being discussed in the realm of national security, but we have to be honest about what we actually mean and what are the real threats. Because if we want to have the American people on board with this agenda, if we want American consumers to benefit, then we have to be true and honest about what the real threats are and how there are issues, particularly with the hackers that Paul mentioned. Most Americans don't know that their credit reports were actually hacked by the Chinese military. This is going around 6 years ago, and they had upwards of 200 million Americans' credit information. Now, I have no idea what they were doing with that. I don't know what database that's going into. And because they're not in an American system of law, we can't sue them to get that information. So that's the kind of stuff that we'll be very wary of. We have to be sure that our policies give the right tools to our institutions to crack down on that behavior and absolutely go against many of the trafficking, go against the gangs. There's a lot of stuff that's been happening in Canada related to some of the trafficking. There's so many large issues to focus on for national security. I just hope we don't expand this to absolutely everything, because I think that would actually make consumers in America worse off.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I'll just add there, since the hacking point has come up a couple of times now. We at the Center for the National Interest a few weeks ago did a really terrific event on Capitol Hill with the National Security Institute at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University, focused on China's Salt Typhoon hack. And Yael, you just mentioned organizations linked to China's military having access to 200 million credit records. In the Salt Typhoon case, from what we can glean from media reports, it sounds like Chinese hackers had actually gotten inside the U.S. government's wiretapping system, and in theory, had access, to every phone call in America for quite some time. So there clearly are some serious issues here. We have a question now from Fred Krishik, who asks, do the two of you believe that the Trump administration is aware of the points that you're making, the concerns that you're raising, especially as they relate to the Chinese Communist Party and the danger that's coming? And again, I think you both have been sort of careful to stress, that there are positive things happening, certainly in China, and there are positive elements of the U.S.-China relationship. Clearly, also, there's some deeply troubling ones. Do you feel that the administration is focused on those, focused on them adequately?
Yeah, I would say yes. President Trump is very attuned to the fact that the Chinese are both an economic competitor and a strategic enemy out there. There's a lot to unpack from all this, though. I mean, the president is very engaged on these issues. He's been very, and also through Vice President Vance and the speeches that he gave in Paris in February, and also to a trade group here in Washington a couple of weeks after that. I mean, his messaging on AI and U.S. tech dominance has been spot on. I believe the president is deferring on a lot of these issues to Vice President Vance. There's certainly a lot of issues the president has to deal with. So, in general, I have found things very encouraging from this administration and its advocacy for U.S. global tech leadership. They've been very confrontational with the European Union on the Digital Markets Act and some of these other measures that are out there, and certainly engaged with the UK. So in general, I think the administration has, I think more than in general, to a great extent, the administration has been spot on in the steps that it has taken, but it's going to be key and critical to maintain that going forward here.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah.
I'm a bit more pessimistic than Paul. I not just because I was born in Canada, but a lot of Trump rhetoric in the beginning has been focused on ally nations and trade relationships, and I think not enough on the adversaries. We only heard the first sort of negative words about Russia from JD Vance, I think, last week. And understanding that this Putin guy, oh, wow, he's actually not following through on anything he said he would. I think there's been a lot of focus on trade, and that's exactly why President Trump was elected. That's why he is so popular amongst sort of the more populist crowd, is that he discusses trade, he talks about tariffs. People really like that. I think when it comes to the adversaries, we just haven't had the correct framing because, again, the first opportunity that he had to address CCP, China, tech policy, any of that was TikTok. And right away, he said, well, we're not going to enforce this because the young people, they like me on TikTok and I'm very popular there. So that was, I think, the first opportunity that President Trump had to discuss this and find a good, solid example. I mean, you mentioned the Salt Typhoon. We haven't even gone through the detail of exactly how many phones this has penetrated, the different types of networks in the government and private sector. There's so much just compromising of all devices and networks that is at the hand of many of these hackers. And it's just, I don't think getting the prime attention it should at the moment. Again, I know that President Trump is getting the briefs. I know that there are all types of different resources being used to try to understand what the CCP is up to, or at least to try to disassemble some of the things that they've built up in the last couple of years. Maybe that's the background of many of the kerfuffle with my own native Canada, because we know that China's had a lot of influence there. That could be. I would love to see a lot more. I think it is very important. And also articulating that it is not for a sort of isolationism, we want nothing to do. It's more that there are real national security concerns, and we have tools and policies to address those. We're going to do that in a responsible way, because we also have to imagine that when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Pakistan and India, China is very involved, and there's a lot that's at stake there. And if we kind of go too hard, too fast, or even if we're just too slow and lackadaisical, we don't really know what could happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So let me ask perhaps a final question here for each of you before we wrap up. You know, I've heard sometimes from some European interlocutors, and I have to confess I'm not closely reading the news reports about each individual EU regulatory action or court case or penalty that's imposed. But I hear sometimes from some European interlocutors that, well, you know, we have our rules in the European Union, and they are what they are. They're not really intended to be anti-American or anti-US big tech in any way, but actually, you know, it's your own American companies, you know, often smaller or maybe medium-sized American companies that are kind of competing with the bigger American tech companies within the EU, you know, outside of the United States. So it's American companies kind of competing with other American companies in Europe. And they are the origin, actually, of much of what's occurring, because they're trying to take advantage of an EU regulatory framework that's more favorable to them than the American one. To what extent do you think there's any truth to that?
Yeah, I think you definitely have that. I think again, one thing I wrote about at National Interest is what Trump has given us is the opportunity to discuss what he calls the non-tariff barriers, essentially just very high regulations, very complicated regulations for American companies. He opened up the Overton window so we could discuss it and talk about it and figure out ways to fix it. Yes, it is true that these are the rules and laws that Europe has introduced, but you know, there's a term that's used a lot in the studies of the European Union is something called the democratic deficit. The European Union has its own issues institutionally. The most powerful countries, Germany and France, have had their own leadership issues, party issues. They have the right wing is growing in both countries. Many other countries are left without a government. And realistically, many things are not stable. And it's essentially the bureaucracy that is creating many of these rules. And yes, there is a system, but it's not necessarily one that is agreed to by every single country. And there are a lot of prick points that come with Hungary and Slovakia, who are very much against many of these proposals, and also Germany and Austria when it comes to things like more control of encrypted devices, for instance. So actually, what makes it Europe so interesting that it is 27 countries who all have completely different points of view, yet there's this overarching supranational institution that kind of makes the decision for everyone. And I think there you are going to continue to have conflict, and that's what makes it so long for these regulatory processes. It's true that it is the European regulation and law, but it doesn't always have to be that way. There are ways to amend them, there are ways to change them, and I think there's increasing pressure to do so, not just because of economic necessity, because Europe itself has not grown very much in the last decade, but also because they can see that they're alienating their allies and partners in places like the United States and meeting the ire of people like President Trump. So I think there's, again, a recognition, but there is a path and an avenue to change. So I'm not, again, totally pessimistic on that point, at least.
Thank you, Yael. So Paul, any final thoughts from you on that point, or more broadly, if there's anything else that you'd like to say before we conclude?
Yes, I think we ought to be quite optimistic about where the United Kingdom and the European Union and the US tech relationship can be in 3 to 4 years. I mean, in the United Kingdom, we have a Labour government that is crying for investment, that has basically said it will jettison regulation and taxes in order to get investment in the country, and which is talking about how essential it is that there be expanded technology, expanded AI in the United Kingdom. Now, granted that they have more infrastructure in that regard than individual European countries, but when we talk about the European Union and we talk about how regulatory minded they are, and how the Draghi report, found that there is just stifling regulation in the country, we tend to think that everyone in the European Union is like the folks leading the European Parliament or those who are in charge want very strict regulations, and that's not the case. I mean, I think it's important for the administration almost to have like a perestroika approach with the European Union. So those who favor more free markets, those who favor taking the heat off of US companies, which is what these laws are targeted to, regardless of how they are talked about or framed in terms of protecting European democracy. That's simply not correct. So I think we have to play, a bit of the long game here to embolden and strengthen those advocates, and hopefully get to the point in 3 to 4 years, or sooner than that, where the European Union has folks who are in charge, similar to Prime Minister Starmer, who are thinking like that and thinking like that because that's the best way to serve their people. The US has a lot to offer here. We have such a dominant tech and AI sector at this point. We won't have it, though, if we, don't cultivate these relationships. But we're in a position of strength here, but we got a lot of work to do to maintain things, and the stakes are quite high.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yael, any last minute thought from you before we conclude?
I think Paul ended it there very brilliantly, so I will add no additional points.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you again to both of you for taking part. Thank you to our audience for listening in. We also appreciate, as I said before, both of you writing for Techland at the National Interest website. I'd certainly encourage everyone listening now and also later on the National Interest website to check out Techland. And I hope we see all of you again very soon. Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye-bye.